This is Professor Hill, and today we are going to do part 1 of primary production and primary producers. What are primary producers? Well, they're basically the organisms on this planet that take raw carbon, mostly from carbon dioxide, and fix it into a form that is available to the rest of the living creatures on this planet. All right, and we already talked about them a little bit in the last lectures when we were talking about photosynthesis and chemosynthesis. Those organisms are the primary producers, and they are the primary production, the base of the food chain on this planet. They're autotrophs, which means that they create their own food. Life on this planet depends completely on them. They are, again, the basis of the food chain. We cannot absorb carbon directly, and it's a main constituent in our bodies, and we need it. You know, we need it for energy, we need it for building blocks for our bodies. Everybody depends on the primary production on the planet. They also, as a byproduct, create oxygen, and again, they fix carbon. So even though some of this seems a little boring, you know, we're talking about little microscopic creatures for the most part, not completely. It's totally essential for life on this planet, so it really is kind of a good thing for everybody to know. All right, so here's kind of a funny looking little diagram. What is this about? This is supposed to be telling you about primary production in the ocean. So in the open ocean, per square meter of water, all right, so here's a square meter of water, most primary production occurs very close to the surface, and they're saying for every square meter of water, every year, 75 to 150 grams of carbon are fixed. They're saying are bound, you know, but are fixed, you know, become part of the food chain, are turned from raw carbon, probably in the form of carbon dioxide, into something that the world can eat, some kind of carbohydrate or plant or something. So I think that there's supposed to be a little petri dish or something, and that's supposed to, it says diatom. That's that is one of the primary producers. We'll talk to you a little bit more about them later. But here we got our carbon dioxide. Our diatom photosynthesizes it and turns it into a form of sugar. The units for primary production are, as you see, grams of carbon per square meter. I don't know. Is it square meter? Yeah, I guess it is. Okay. Per square meter per year. I thought it was cubic. I'll let you know if I find out that's opposite. Now, for every 10 grams of primary producer, it takes 1 gram of carbon to make him or her or it, you know. So basically, it's taking 1 gram or 1 unit of carbon and creating 10 units of itself. So it is the only part of the food chain where it's not losing energy as it goes down. It's actually gaining energy, okay? So yeah, in this example here, you know, they're saying if a diatom, a primary producer, binds 120 grams of carbon per meter squared per year, what would be the mass of the diatoms? That would be 10 times that, or 1,200. So they are, again, just the opposite. For us, you know, in our part of the food chain, because we're a top consumer, we lose 10 times the mass every time we go up. But they are actually going the opposite way. They're like an inverted pyramid, a pyramid on its head. All right, so let me introduce you to a few of our planktonic primary producers. Okay, first of all, planktonic means that they're floaters, basically. Some of them might be able to maneuver a little bit, but they cannot fight a strong current. Basically, they're moved around by currents. They come in extreme range of sizes, from microscopic, in fact, microscopic, to huge, 100 feet long. All right, they're both plants and they're animals. We call the phytoplanktonic plants autotrophs, and our planktonic animals are heterotrophs. But the planktonic animals are not involved in primary production, so I really shouldn't have put them in there. Maybe I better cross them off. Okay, I'll continue recording. Yeah, let's take them out, because this is all supposed to be all about primary production, and of course an animal is not a primary producer. Okay, so that's just telling you a little bit about that planktonic things can actually be animals, but that's not really important to us. Okay. Again, half the carbonates on the planet are made in the ocean, and half are made on the land. And about half of our oxygen comes from the ocean, about half comes from the land. So a lot of times I have people ask me, why do you teach oceanography in the desert? Because the ocean affects life everywhere. All right, let me introduce you to some of the different size ranges. Here are the really, really, really small plankton. Okay, the virus-sized plankton. So what do we got? A tenth, a hundredth, a thousandth, a 10,000th. So this is 2 to the 10,000ths of a meter. And so it's extremely small. In fact, they're so small that they actually aren't in the, we were talking about the marine food web last time, you know, and the trophic levels and stuff. These guys actually have their own little microbial web because they're too small to be part of ours. They're too small for the animals and plants that are in our web to eat them. They're just too small. And these guys are the same way. You know, they're a little bit bigger, up to 10 hundredths to thousandths of a millimeter, apparently. And so this is microscopic electron microscope, probably pictures of them. But again, they're not in our food chain. So they're in these two groups, the picto and the femto, are in their own microbial loop. Now, we get on to the ones that are in our food web. The nanoplankton, and again, we're getting a little bit bigger here, right, from that last small size up an order of magnitude. We got a couple of them. Then we got the micros, and then you notice we're going up an order of magnitude, you know, 10 times every single time we go up. These guys are 10 times bigger than the ones before. These are 10 times bigger than the ones before. So that's how they divide up plankton, basically, by size, because you can see they come in a wide variety of shapes. Then we got the next biggest size, the mesoplankton. And then we have the macroplankton, which get all the way up to 20 millimeters. So, you know, at this point, 2 millimeters, you could possibly see them, you know, not very easily. They'd be about the thickness of maybe your a toenail. Not your big toenail, but a toenail. These guys, though, are up to 20 millimeters, so that's probably about, I don't know, 2 finger sizes side by side. So now we're getting a little bit bigger. And then we get to the megaplankton, the ones that are bigger than that, okay? And now you see things that you probably recognize, right? Our jellyfish and called seaweed. Yeah, we'll get to that later. But anyway, again, they're planktonic. They float. They can't fight a current. I mean, jellyfish can propel themselves a little bit, but they can't fight a current. They're pretty much drifters. So of those groups, I want to look at these guys just a little bit more, these 6 groups. All right, and again, the reason I wanted to talk about the pico and the femto is just to say that they are outside our trophic pyramid because they are so small that even the smallest zooplankton in the trophic web that we are consumers in could not eat these guys. So I won't ask you questions about what they do, but I just want you to know that. They have their own separate web. Now, this part I might want you to know about because this is interesting. At least it's interesting to me. There is about 100 million of these things in every liter of seawater all around the globe. It's amazing how much life that is. 100 million in every liter of water everywhere. But we have something like 8 billion people on the planet, so for each billion that would be 10 liters, so 10 times 8, 80 liters of water. 80 liters of water. That's hardly any water at all, right? That's not even enough water to fill this room to the top of my desk. And that's got more life in it than there are people on this planet. It's amazing. Okay, they have a special chlorophyll. You know, some of them are autotrophs. They're primary producers. That's why they're in here. They absorb blue light and work well in low light, so they can live further down in the water column than photosynthesizers that need strong light. They are primary producers again, like I just said, but they're also decomposers. These are some of the decomposers of the world, the things that break down everything else when it dies. Those things I might want you to know. All right. Cyanobacteria, also an autotroph, also a primary producer. I think these are very interesting because they are the oldest life form on our planet that we know of. They are approximately 3.5 billion years old. They're also known as blue-green algae. They are responsible for the great oxygenation event. Oxygenation. Let me tell you a little bit about that. That's a very interesting part in our Earth's history. The planet did not form with an oxygen-rich environment like we live in now. That oxygen was put here by plants, and mostly it was put here by these blue-green algae. They actually created the environment that made it possible for those of us that are multicellular to exist. They lived on the planet by themselves for more than 1 billion years, and all they were doing was, you know, photosynthesizing and giving off oxygen. For them, oxygen was a waste product. It was no use. And they actually almost killed, you see it says near extinction of anaerobic organisms. Anaerobic organisms are oxygen-philic, basically. They don't like oxygen. They do well in anaerobic conditions, meaning oxygen poor or oxygen absent conditions. So there was a lot of those on the planet. There was more of those on the planet, let's just put it that way, before the great oxygenation event. But a lot of them died off when the great oxygenation event happened. And what that meant was, that was the point in Earth's history, I believe, I'm not positive about this amount, but I believe it was when the oxygen level got to more than 10%. That was really bad for the anaerobic environments, but it caused evolution to take a new turn, so that creatures that would like and can use oxygen, because oxygen's a high octane fuel. That's why we use it, right? We're multicellular, we have big brains, and we run all around, most of us. We need oxygen, right? But we would never have evolved if it wasn't for the blue-green algae. So I think they're very interesting, and they fossilize well because they make these mounds. They're very small. They're actually very small bacteria, but they kind of like live together in apartments, sort of. And when sand washes over them, they just make a new layer. So they build up these cabbagey looking things, and they fossilize. Pretty fossils too. They're called stromatolites. All right, on to another group, the diatoms. Why are they important? Well, there's a lot of them. Number one, they're the second most productive planktonic primary producer on this planet. You know, they're responsible for a great deal of our oxygen. They're responsible for fixing a lot of carbon. They're pretty. They're bilaterally symmetrical. That means that one side looks the same as the other side. They tend to have 2 valves. They're siliceous. That means they're made of silica, so they're kind of hard. They can reproduce asexually and sexually. They produce asexually by just dividing up to a certain point, and then when that point makes it so that, because each time they are a little bit smaller when they're just dividing, when they get too small, then they reproduce sexually, and then they start back up at a large size again. Dinoflagellates. Okay, there's their size. they're interesting for a number of reasons. They're single-celled, for one thing. You know, they're just one cell. That's why they're so small, but they are mostly free-living. You know, they float in the water, unattached to things, and they have what they call, I think they're called flagellates. I think the flagellate is the part that makes it so that they can turn a little bit. You know, they are planktonic, they can't resist a strong current, but they can maneuver themselves so they're facing the sunlight, which helps them photosynthesize, of course. Some of them bioluminesce, which is what they're showing you in that picture there with the green glowing ocean. They create light during oxidation. Kind of neat, hey? They also are responsible for a lot of shellfish poisoning. I don't know if you ever live near the coast. They'll sometimes have red tide warnings, they're called, because a lot of them, this certain variety of them is red. And when they bloom and have massive amounts, it poisons the fish and the shellfish, and people can't, well, they're poisons as far as humans are concerned. We cannot consume fish or shellfish that have been in those environments. Another interesting thing about dinoflagellates is that they are responsible for the color in coral. They have a symbiotic relationship with coral, meaning symbiotic means two things live together, but they live in such a way that it's beneficial for both of them. So the coral have these itty bitty, you know, teeny tiny. Here's supposed to be a coral here on the right, and they're trying to show you a close-up of its epidermis. And so they show you the epidermal tissue, and you see these little itty bitty dots down in there. Those would be the symbiotic dinoflagellates. And what they're doing is they are primary producers, so they photosynthesize. And so they're creating glucose, they're creating carbonates, and they share the carbonates with the coral. The coral is actually an animal. And what does so the coral is obviously benefiting from this relationship. But what do the dinoflagellates get out of it? Well, they're itty bitty teeny tiny. They get to live in the coral where they don't have to drift along in the currents, and the corals always live close to the surface so that they can always get sunlight, and so that allows their little dinoflagellates in their epidermal tissue to have constant sunlight so that they can, you know, do what they do, which is photosynthesize. So they protect them and keep them from getting washed around in the surf, and they both benefit. So dinoflagellates are interesting in a lot of ways. So let's move on to coccolithophores. Coccolithophores are, let's see, I don't know if they make calcium carbonate chalk anymore, but these are the little guys that used to make the old-fashioned chalk that they used to write on chalkboards. They photosynthesize. They're plants. They're very, very tiny. You see this little red line down here? This is 2 micrometers. So micrometer is 1/1,000,000th of a meter. Okay, so these guys are only 3-4 micrometers across, so you can't really see them. They also are a primary producer, and they produce a great deal of the oxygen that is breathed on this planet. They make these little plates of calcium carbonate, and when they die, they tend to drift down to the bottom of the ocean in what we call marine snow. Later on that, but they accumulate, and the chalk cliffs of Dover, I don't know if you've ever heard of them, they're cliffs in South England. They're up to 350 feet tall. Those are made of coccolithophores. They're chalk, and chalk is made of coccolithophores, these itty-bitty microscopic creatures. There's so many of them. Died and fell to the bottom of the ocean, where they collected on the continental shelf until they got raised out of the water. More on that in a second. But the sedimentation rate on the continental shelf is only 10 to 40 centimeters per 1,000 years. This is like about 10 centimeters. This is like about 40 centimeters. That's how many how many inches, or well, how many centimeters, how much thickness of coccolithophores accumulate every 1,000 years on the continental shelf. And we've got 350 feet of it sticking out of the water in the south of England. And there's probably more below the sand, right? So why is it sticking out of the water if it's made from a sea creature that supposedly lives and dies in the ocean? Well, back to our friend from the earlier chapter in geology, plate tectonics. It's actually because Africa, the African plate is actually moving north, and it's closing up the Mediterranean, and it's huge continent. It not only has all of Africa on it, but it has a lot of the ocean all around Africa on it. It's a big plate, and it's moving north, and it's crunching up against the other plates, Europe and Northern Europe, all the way up to England, and it's actually pushed this part of what was a continental shelf out of the water. Kind of cool, hey? This is the sedimentation rate in the abyssal plain. So as you can see, now that's a half to 1 centimeter a year. So we're talking like, I'm sorry, a year, every 1,000 years. So the sedimentation rate out in the open ocean, as you can see, is much, much less. So that's our first clue. Most primary production in the ocean is done closer to shore. Wonder why that would be. We'll see a little bit more later. Okay, megaplankton. That was the last plankton I wanted to talk about. The ones that are bigger than 20 millimeters, okay? That would include, you know, our friends, the seaweed. I know that there's a lot of seaweed on the West Coast, and so I kind of wanted to include this in case, you know, you're traveling out there in California and you come across it, so you'll know a little bit more about it. It's not a regular plant. It is a multicellular algae, actually. It has, down at the bottom, it has what they call a holdfast. It needs to be on rocky ground because it needs to hold on to rocks. But it doesn't have roots. It's not a vascular plant. It does need sunlight. It's a primary producer. It photosynthesizes. So it has to be at depths of less than 115 feet because it needs the light. It needs nutrients. It likes cool waters. The waters off the West Coast are cool compared to the waters off the East Coast, which tend to be warm because of, and we went through this already earlier in the book, the winds which push the ocean currents, right? The currents on the East Coast are coming up from the equator. The currents on the West Coast are coming down from Alaska. All right. So anyway, that's a little bit about algae. Multicellular algae. All right, on to part 2.